Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Fascist? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Fire Nation from Avatar The Last Airbender. Now, it's been a little while since I've sat down and watched the show in its entirety, but I did do a fair amount of research and make some notes and consider this beforehand, so it should mostly be on point. Also, as whenever I'm doing a sci fi pulsi or anything like this, I'm going to be filling in the blanks quite a bit, which with how I think certain things they might not touch on would be based on other things they do touch on. Because surprise, surprise, most people who do write fiction, but even stuff that deals with politics, are not political scientists. Their main focus is not to create an entire self-contained Frank Herbert 1984-esque political system. They just kind of have bits and pieces there. And to me, it's more interesting if I try to take a more holistic perspective. And that normally includes filling in the blanks. So, the Fire Nation in Avatar The Last Airbender. Very clearly, it is based off of Japan, specifically imperialist Japan, post Meiji Japan. From my understanding, prior to the reign of Fire Lord Sozin, the Fire Lord had very little actual power, and the country was controlled by lords, although for the sake of this video, I'll call them daimyos. So the daimyos controlled the Fire Nation, and Sozin was the one who was able to, through brutality and cunning and that sort of thing, unite the country under his absolute rule. Over the course of his reign, the Fire Nation would become increasingly centralized, and he sponsored industrialization, technological progress, and in general, the Fire Nation rapidly became the most modern country within the Avatar world. As I said, very similar to Japan, in which you have a fragmented country where the nobility hold a lot of power, although that somewhat ended under the Edo period, as the Tokugawa were much more powerful than previous shogunates. But I digress, in which power was theoretically restored to the emperor and the central government, and you undertook an industrial revolution followed by a attempt to break out of their small resource limited islands by conquering not China, aka the Earth Kingdom. By the time we get to Avatar The Last Airbender, the war has been going on for around 100 years or so, wherein a series of Fire Lords have launched offensives against most of the world's other powers. I believe they've taken most of the Earth Kingdom by this point in time. They mostly exterminated the Southern Water Tribe. The Airbit nomads are completely wiped out, with the exception of Ong, of course. And the Northern Water Tribe seems to be the only major power that hasn't been affected by the war in a significant way. At the start of the series, it appears that global domination by the Fire Nation is very much a foregone conclusion. The Earth Kingdom really doesn't have an army large enough or centralized enough or capable of dealing with modern technology. The Northern Water Tribe is fairly isolationist, if I recall. And with there being no real large scale opponent to them, it seems that even if it takes a while, they're going to gradually take over the rest of the Earth Kingdom. Whether or not the idea is to balkanize the Earth Kingdom into vassal states or outright exterminate the population and replace them with settlers, we aren't entirely certain, but they're definitely in the dominant position when we begin the saga of Avatar The Last Airbender. So, that being said, looking at the background, let's go through our scale and determine, is the Fire Nation fascist? Now, some people will argue it can't be because it's a monarchy, although ironically enough, Italy, where fascism came from, was a monarchy. Although you can argue it was a ceremonial monarchy, and Mussolini held all of the real power, so it kind of doesn't count. I don't think it really matters what leadership system you have. It can be a oligarchy, it can be a triumvirate, it can be a autocracy, a monarchy. I think that's somewhat secondary, and we will score it based on that. So, number one, an ideologically syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary slash progressive ideas. Now, if we just go solely off of the original Avatar, this very well might not be the case. The Fire Nation is a very progressive country. It's explicitly shown that they've shed a lot of their spiritual past. The Fire Sages have been sidelined. Religion no longer plays a major role in their lives, especially if you get into the idea that the country was really only united under Sozin, and the extreme nationalism and ethnocentrism was a product of that era. You could once again make the case that it's kind of like the French Revolution or something, where it's the ideology is a contrivance that came out of um, modernism. The problem with this, though, is in trying to make the Fire Nation seem more evil, they actually made them a lot more conservative and less progressive. It seems that under Sozin, who seems to be the only socially conservative person in the entire Avatar world, he outlawed same-sex relationships, gender transition, gender non-binary. It appears that there was, I think, the nuclear family was fairly traditional in the Fire Nation. That was promoted even more, and the number of women in the military dramatically decreased, and it seems like it became a much more patriarchal state under his reign. So it does seem that despite all the progressive elements, a lot of the social policies that were undertaken were what we would consider at least fairly conservative. The Avatar world has this weird thing where it seems like it's the opposite of our world, where in traditional societies we're more accepting of transsexuals, and then modern societies become less so, and then they became more so again. Regardless, though, it seems that the Northern Water Tribe and the Fire Nation seem to be more patriarchal. It's hard to tell once again because they released all this nonsense like after the show ended. So while the ultra nationalism is not necessarily traditional, I'm going to give them half a point for this because they did, much like Japan in the real world, they destroyed the religious content of their society in favor of making it more nationalistic. They would have gotten a zero, though, pre the revisions. Identitarianism with a clearly defined in group and out group. I mean, this is 100% the case. Initially, it seemed that Sozin had an idea to make it a more ideological struggle, or the idea of a civilizing mission, or that the world would be better and run on time. This almost kind of like Sauron-ish. I'm going to bring progress to the world. And it kind of just went into generic ethno nationalism, with the idea being that they would displace or enslave the residents of the Earth Kingdom, and the rest of the world would be turned into colonies to ship resources to the mainland. So it seems like one of the a very clear case of ethno-cultural nationalism that explicitly excludes non-Fire Nationers. A revanchist, a romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. Now, I wasn't able to find that much about the Fire Nation's history. In the case of Japan, there was this myth, whether it was true or not, that the emperor used to have power and it was usurped by the nobility, and that it was the Meiji Restoration. It wasn't Meiji taking power that the emperor had never had before, it was him regaining historical powers that were taken away. You also had feelings that Japan had been treated poorly by some of the Western powers. Eventually, you got, particularly during the World War II era, nationalism got a lot more romantic. My understanding is during the Meiji era, they regarded stuff like samurai and that kind of thing as being very cringy, very regressive, and very embarrassing. I know it went so far that during the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese army no longer trained its soldiers in hand-to-hand combat because that was considered to be barbaric and beneath a modern army. And the Russians beat them in a number of cases because they undertook bayonet charges. Also, I'd imagine Russians are about 6 inches taller, but that's for another time. So, I don't know. There isn't really a revanchist aspect to this because we don't really know what the past is. But it's so like. I'm just going to have to give it a point, even if this isn't technically the case. It's hard to find a society that's more ultra nationalistic than the Fire Nation is. So I'm going to reluctantly give it a point here. You can see what I mean by the whole conception of I have to fill in the blanks because there's not necessarily primary material. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. I mean, I don't really think that that's a thing here. The fire, it's an absolute monarchy. It's a totalitarian society in which all citizens exist to serve the Fire Lord and to serve the Fire Nation. I don't really think I need to go into that much detail. If you look at like what their educational curriculum looks like, how their military is structured, basically everything points in this direction. A conception of a new idealized man. I'm actually going to give them a point here, not just because Sosin adopted social policies that dramatically changed gender relations, but there does seem to very much be a case, as there kind of was in Japan, that where we've moved past superstition, they kill the moon spirit. I think this was more fleshed out in the movie, actually. It's been a long time since I've seen it, but I think the movie portrayed the Fire Nation as having a crusade against domination by the spirits. The idea that the Fire Nation, the new man, was willing to sacrifice himself for the good of the state, to die for his emperor, to die for the Fire Lord, and was always seeking self improvement and new technology. So they get a point there as well. A foreign policy that places national self interest above ideology or morality. This is one I recently jiggered a bit with some suggestions from SERP. I mean, initially there was some pretense that it was this ideological commitment to civilize the world. They gave up on that more or less, and it's just an attempt to steal resources and deal with the fact that the Fire Nation has very little land to work with. So it gets a point there. Next one. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. I'm actually going to say no for this because industrialization is the major focus. You do not get that much of a mind over matter kind of ideology when you're starting to go through the whole Fire Nation thing. Industry, quotas, production, access to resources was a core reason for it. And even if it's not necessarily there's a defined economic system, it appears, I would imagine, some sort of Zaibatsu state capitalism thing going. A masculine approach to problem solving focusing on decisive action. Well, given that the war started off with a genocide, and by and large their policy appears to mostly be composed of directly attacking people using overwhelming force, that they thought Zuko was like a massive pussy. And just any number of other things. It appears the nation very much does value direct action, to be a man of action, to be willing to use violence to solve your problems. Encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. It does seem, from what we can determine, even if there isn't a political party, and I'm mostly going off of the episode where they go to a not Fire Emblem, a Fire Nation school, but there does appear to be a very Japanese-ish focus on total war, that every person must be 100% committed to the war effort, to the state, to national development, and it's everybody's duty to serve the nation. In a very direct fashion. I don't think we see too many patriotic demonstrations, but I'm sure you have stuff like patriotic demonstrations. You might even have some form of a nascent political party in the form of a cult of personality around the Fire Lord. So they get a point there. Next, we have Vanguardism, or the belief in an inner group to safeguard the new order/revolution. I'm going to have to think about this one a bit in the future, because I don't know how this would apply to autocracies. Because in most cases, like even if you look at something like Nazi Germany, you do have an inner circle, you have a party who's there to serve as the vanguard. Even if Hitler theoretically has absolute power, I just don't think you really have that much of that in the case of the Fire Nation. I think the country is just so centralized that The Fire Lord just controls all power. Maybe some of the bureaucrats have some. I can't really recall there being much of that. A lot of the military commanders seem to just do whatever they want to do. But I'm going to actually have to say no. It's not a vanguardist state. An often charismatic leader who wields absolute or near absolute power over the state or movement. I mean, it's once again, it's based off of Imperial Japan. The entire thing is willing to live and die for your emperor. Sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. Once again, this is very much the case. I don't think this is really a question. There is a total war economy. Every aspect of society is completely and totally devoted and engaged towards the maintenance of total war. And with that, let's add the points up. So once again, we have a tie. I have a 9.5 for the Fire Nation. The one that is on the cusp of making it go into one category or another is the ideological syncretism. And this one is very, very difficult because I do think it's very much a on the border of the two. The other ones that lowered the amount would be number 7, indifference or marginalization of economics, and Vanguardism. I suppose what I could do, because I don't like to leave it in between, is give them half a point for Vanguardism, in that the Fire Lord themselves is the vanguard of progress of the Fire Nation itself. It's very difficult, though. I think you can make a case either way on this one, because it is very much a let's see. Why is it doing this? We'll do it live. There we go. It is very much a kind of on the borderline between the two. The main thing, once again, we don't have here is the revanchist historical desire to kind of revenge itself against perceived slights in the past. Maybe that's just something I missed from the lore. And there's no political party. Those are really the only two things that prevent it from being kind of an exemplar of fascism. I think on the whole, though, given that this is based on like 1930s Japan, clearly what they were trying to go with, I'm going to have to give this a 10 points on the whole and say the Fire Nation is fascist. Although it's kind of on the borderline, and like I said, I had to take some leaps when I was doing this one. I'm still kind of up in the air. Maybe I'll just leave this one as 9.5 and say you can tilt it either way you want. The only thing, like I said, that's keeping it from just saying it's fascist is there's no political party, and it's kind of ambiguous as to how much of its nationalism seems more progressive than romantic. You know what? I'm gonna give it a 0.5 for the romantic nationalism thing, and we're gonna put this as parafascist at 9 points out of 10, out of 12, I should say. So I think I'm gonna go with that. Once again, I think it's very much you can go in either direction on this one, but the final count is 9 out of 10 points, and yeah, it is not quite fascist, but it is on the borderline of that, and that's obviously where they were intending to go when they made the series. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. More to come. God bless, and I'll talk to everybody real soon.